Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, tonight's going to be a little thick, so I apologize to everyone. But we're going to actually try something a little bit broader. We're going to actually play economist. I'm going to try actually to walk through 3 or 4 themes here of why what we must do is so difficult, why it absolutely has to happen, and the truth about the math. So let's have some fun here. Because I know everyone around here is a genius and we spend lots of time reading difficult things, I'm sure every member of Congress got their hand on the latest McKinsey report that came out a few days ago that actually walked through in beautiful detail what's happening in the industrialized world with the lack of young people. Okay, so let's walk through this. Idiots like me have been coming behind this microphone for almost a decade, talking about the morality of prosperity. Well, I don't care if you're on the left, right, but having a society that grows and becomes prosperous and it becomes more and more productive and can provide better things is moral. But also, why is it so hard? Look, this was done by our own CBO, taking updates from the data from the Census Bureau. In 8 years, the United States has more deaths than births. Last year, we had 17 states that had more deaths than births. Okay. So, and if you read through, the term now has become absence of young people. And there's lots of crazy discussions. There's entire books. I have all these things on my shelves about natalist policies and how many countries have tried to encourage higher fertility rates and all failed. There really is no success in the entire world. They've been able to move forward some of the fertility rates spiking up, and then they go back and fall back to the mean. It is the nature of wealth, is the nature of modern societies. But then you come to me and say, David, you're on Ways and Means. You chair the Joint Economic Committee, so you have all these economists that work for you. Show me how we're going to have 3% GDP growth every year. I can show you how to do it. I just need you to understand. The United States is better off than so many countries, but the fact of the matter is, you know, we're having fewer children than countries like France. 8 years, we have more deaths than births. And you all remember your first year of economics class where they walked through your formula and said, well, population growth, then capital expenditures for plant and equipment that are more productive, then spikes in technology. That's how you build the wealth of a nation. We are losing one of the things. So when you see people like me walk behind these microphones, you need to hear coming out of their mouths, I'm willing to actually deal with the reality of how do we make capital investments in equipment that makes us more productive? How do we encourage the synthetic biology that makes us not only live longer, but able to survive and do well and enjoy life? How do you actually deal with not being fearful of AI and artificial intelligence, but use that to make this another American century? Because I can't make the math work without the adoption of labor substitutes. And I'm going to actually show something here that seems to make people mad when I get to it. But the reality of it is, let's wait, but I'm going to actually make a pitch that what are the 2 extraordinary privileges of this country? Okay, you're going to hear monetarists come behind the microphone all the time and say, hey, people want to use the U.S. dollar. People must use the U.S. dollar to borrow in, to trade in, to hold assets. Do you want to know as an economist what actually is even more valuable than having the world reserve currency? Smart people, entrepreneurs, people with wealth want to invest in their lives, their time, their talents in the United States. We hold the 2 greatest extraordinary privileges from a worldwide economist. We have to start understanding the math and what we're up against, because it's not us. The entire world. Now, you start to take a look at what's going on, and I know some of these charts are almost impossible to read, but the basic points of many of these is we've all talked about, well, baby boomers, they're, a couple more years and all of them are 65 up and we have this huge population bubble. And the fact of the matter is over the next 10 years, we hate to say this because we get booed at our town halls when we say this, the next 10 years, almost 100% of U.S. debt is interest and the growth of the cost of Medicare. And we've known for how many years baby boomers were going to turn 65? 65 years. But we didn't plan for it, we didn't set it aside. And one thing we weren't ready for as a society, in 1990, fertility rates started to roll over. So it's the absence, as the McKinsey report goes up and down, it's the absence of young people. Now make an economy grow. So look, some of the points I'm going to try to make here is this one, I need people to think. You saw the kerfuffle last week when Elon Musk and some of the others got into the, H-1B visas, bringing talent into the country. I'm actually not even sure I like the H-1 process. I'd like to move maybe to a talent-based system. But the entire world, the entire industrialized world is going through things very similar to us. China's numbers look, it's the craziest chart you're ever going to see. It's like a boom. So in the 70s and 80s, the world competed for hydrocarbons, oil. You remember the oil. Last decade, we sort of battled for where we could have supplies of rare earths. Some of the smartest economists that actually do demographics are now saying the industrialized world is going to knife each other for smart people. Now, maybe a smart person is the great carpenter or the synthetic biologist, but we need to start being honest with each other that you want us, particularly my economic team, to say, build us ideas, build us a plan as we get ready to do reconciliation, do the things that provide us the growth so we can still be Americans, that sort of beacon of prosperity. You got to understand, 8 years, more deaths than births. Are we going to be willing to do very difficult things and move to a talent-based immigration system that doesn't care about your race, your gender, who you cuddle with, anything else, cares about the talent? And I've actually done entire presentations here where I've shown what happened at the border over the last 4 years will make the working poor poorer in this country. It's math. It's not my opinion. I'm not demagoguing. It's math. You have a part of your society, we call the quartiles, which I sort of despise that term. You didn't graduate high school, so what you do economically is you sell your willingness to work. You go out and hang drywall. You bust your backside. And then tomorrow you're competing against millions of other people with the same skill set. And you actually look at how our economy works and the fact that, let's be brutal, populations under a certain income, they will receive services from our society because we're a compassionate society. But when you start to see a talent-based immigration system, you have people here, because the productivity they bring to society, turns out when you look at their career, they pay a boatload of taxes and actually help us grow. Need to deal with the math. And the fact of the matter is, we look over and over at these things, and you see countries like the United States. Now, I'm just using Japan because it's easy. Japan has, almost 300% debt to GDP, but it's a unique society because their corporations, their individuals, actually finance almost their entire debt, where the United States, we're chewing up much of our capital stock now because we're borrowing somewhere between maybe 70 to, if you actually just take this fiscal year, as high as $80,000 every second. Every second of every day we're borrowing. We borrow $6-7 billion every single day. So, and I've done the chart before, but think about this. We click off an additional $1 trillion of borrowing about every 125 days. You think it's going to go on forever? I'm going to show you in part of the second part of this, the number of the biggest bond traders in the world. You know, when Larry Fink, when Ray Dalio are basically saying, you guys got a problem and it's coming fast. When they're actually taking billions of dollars and starting to hedge even the U.S. bonds, saying, we think you're going to 5-6%. And understand, if the United States ever went back to what was normal before the Great Recession of 2008, we went back to a 6% handle on U.S. debt. In 9 years, 45% of all tax collections are interest. Why doesn't that scare the crap out of people? And then we're going to engage in policies where we're doing our best to scare to death the very people we're turning to and saying, please buy our bonds? How do we do what's necessary, particularly in reconciliation, to not hurt working people by having their taxes go up because of the expiring provisions of TCJA, but also at the same time deal with the math that if we finance everything, because we're already scheduled to borrow about $22 trillion additional between now and I think 2034, is the intent to stack another $5 trillion on top of that? You don't think the bond markets aren't going to punish us? Because little bits of interest just crush not only the U.S. government, but they crush working people. How many people can afford a mortgage right now when it's over 7%? How many can afford the car loan? Understand, we just went through functionally 3-4 years of inflation where in my community, if you don't make 27% more, you're poor today. So we talk, isn't the employment rate great? It is, but it's wage growth, and wage growth goes up by two things. Inflation, which means you are not getting ahead, you're just treading water, or productivity. But when you're lacking population growth, okay. How do you get productivity? Regulatory policy, good trade policy, great tax policy that makes it so you're investing in plant and equipment and research and development to do it better, faster, cheaper. That's how you make people less poor. And this one's a little tricky, but it's a fascinating if you actually dig into the article. If you're out of your mind or you're geeky or you just don't have a life or you don't have a Netflix subscription, but you actually sort of dig into what level of productivity growth do you actually need just to sustain sort of your lifestyle. And it's all sorts of different countries. And for the United States, you need almost about a 2%, where we're looking at the different years. But you see the pink line? We calculate if you're not having at least a 1.8% productivity gain, which is a lot, you're functionally poor. You become poor. And for all the people who complain about, well, don't do tax cuts for business, okay? Don't do regulatory change for business, okay? Now, go read the literature. We know that in 2017, what we did in changing the corporate tax rates, getting companies to move their monies back here, getting them to invest in productivity, those things, we calculate from 60 to 70% of every dime they got went into wages. Because once again, the primary way people make more money is productivity. And this is the chart I'm sure will show up in an election ad beating the crap out of me. But you see this spike? That was the years of the open border. We go back to normality, where the immigration system, except we're the last country really on earth that uses a familial system. Familial system, you sponsor someone because your grandma was here, and your grandma sponsors her sister, and they sponsored theirs. That's a familial immigration system. My argument is, as part of when we're starting to deal with productivity for the society, we actually have to start thinking about it from top to bottom. It's not just great AI policy. It's not just great synthetic biology policy. It's not great regulatory policy. It's just a great tax policy. It's also going to have to be immigration. All right, now on to sort of the reality where we're at. We actually got, I'm going to call it better news. CBO actually did some calculations and said, hey, we expect tax receipts to be up in this fiscal year. So I've come here repeatedly and shown my chart that says for every dollar the United States takes in all sorts of tax receipts. And remember, most of those tax receipts are going to Social Security, Medicare, those sorts of things. But for every dollar we take in 39 cents, $1.39 is spent. Guess what? The good news is now it's no longer $1.39 of spending for every dollar we take in. Now it's $1.36. Got better. Still terrifyingly bad. And this is the improvement that so many people were running around being giddy about. So let's actually sort of walk through some of these numbers as quickly as we can. Federal spending as a share of total tax revenues. The reason I'm showing you this is to give you an idea the scale we're up against. If you actually take all of our tax receipts, every dime, and say, here's what we call mandatory spending. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and interest, because you got to pay your interest. We're the ones who basically binge on debt. It consumes every dollar of tax receipts plus some. We actually don't collect enough taxes to pay for our mandatory spending and our interest. And that's our basic problem, is if you do net interest and mandatory spending, it consumes everything. So the point from this chart is very simple. Everything, Mr. Speaker, you and I vote on, everything a member of Congress votes on is on borrowed money. Every dime of defense, every dime of non-defense discretionary. But we're going to do theatrical things, go on our local talk radio show, go on cable television, sometimes stand behind these mics and say things that may be great policy, but we act like it actually will make a difference to these sorts of numbers, and it doesn't. I've heard my brothers and sisters here say things like, okay, health care or Obamacare subsidies for those who are here illegally. Okay, I'm fine. Go ahead and get rid of them. It's 9.5 hours for an entire year's worth of borrowing. So an entire year, you just covered 9.5 hours. Don't act like it's a solution. It's one of 1,000 things you have to do. And here's the classic problem of the way this place thinks. Turns out fixing things are complex. And we live in a society with these things where we have attention spans. We want something that's simple, flashy, short. Well, it turns out complexity often requires a complex solution. It's hard. You're going to have people, the armies of the lobbyists in the hallways, mad at us. They don't like it when we tell the truth. Heaven forbid, have you ever gone home and talked to your voters and they think it's, if you just got rid of foreign aid, and then you show them the chart, it's about a week of borrowing. And they just stare at you with daggers like, how can that be? It's not their fault. I believe the political class, the commentary class, let's be honest, a lot of the partisan media class have just made crap up for years. I challenge my brothers and sisters on the left to the right, know your math and start telling the truth. Because you look at charts like this, where this right here is break even. This is where the dollars. And even this year, every dime of discretionary and a little sliver of mandatory are on borrowed money once again. And the only reason I threw this chart in the way it is, where we did 24, 25. You see this? That was with the CBO's calculations that, hey, the law says next year they get to take in 400 billion some additional taxes because Americans' taxes go up. Well, we don't want that to happen. We want to protect hardworking people. The very last board I'm going to show here is the way you protect American people is you offset as much of that as you can, because you give it to hardworking folks and then you take it away from them in higher interest costs, in higher financing costs. You smile at them, you hand them $1 in their face, and you're grabbing their wallet from behind and stealing it from them. That moment of telling the truth about math is really important. Look, I brought a lot of the boards just trying to explain that, last couple of years, 39 cents out of every dollar, for every dollar we took in tax receipts, we spent $1.39. This year we're going to spend $1.36, which means all that differential. Reason I have this, it's a little complex, but to make it super, super simple as best I can. You're going to hear lots of, particularly Democrats and others, say, well, the tax reform, it caused this, it caused that. Well, the charts now, you got to work through the incredible craziness of the pandemic. But if you actually take a look at the matching of TCJA and what we expected to be inflation-adjusted tax receipts. So I'm not playing the scam of, look at how much more money we're getting, even though we've had like 25% inflation. An honest number, when you actually calculate it and normalize it, guess what? Tax receipts are pretty much right on track. And we have a couple of these, to give you sort of a sense. When you take a look at annual revenues match pre-TCJA projections, this one's important, and we often don't actually talk about it. Go back to the baseline numbers of CBO and joint tax before we did tax reform in 2017, and then step up to where we are today and take a look where we are, where baseline is. Adjust for inflation, it's normal. The math is normal. So when someone says, well, it's because you did this tax reform and you helped the economy, I'm not standing in front of you saying tax cuts pay for themselves. What I am saying is the scale of the economy actually today is right on track to what the projections were before tax reform. Some of that it's a complex calculation of everything from technology adoptions to new ways we do things to productivity gains. But the baseline number is the baseline number. And back to trying to make the point. Do we have is the issue with the United States binging on debt? Is it we don't collect enough taxes, or is it we spend too much money? I've done entire presentations here where I've shown high marginal tax rates, low marginal tax rates, and we seem to hold about 17% of the size of the economy in taxes. 17% of GDP you'll often hear. And it's historic. It just somehow, when you raise up the marginal tax rates, you're getting 17% of the economy. And part of that is a offset because the economy slows down. When you've done low marginal tax rates, economy grows. So you're getting 17% of the economy because the economy is expanded. Trying to make the point that growth is moral, it's also great economics. How do you grow, grow, grow? But I just showed you in the beginning portion of this, we got an issue. In 8 years, we have more deaths than births. We have a demographic issues. Remember, debt demographics. Demographics are your destiny. So, look, I'm just trying to point out on this. Over the last 4 years, we functionally have borrowed $7.8 trillion in deficits. That borrowing functionally is a current stimulus effect, but you're going to pay for it. It's coming out of your retirement, whether you know it or not. It's coming out of your kids. The insanity is, I'm 62, my wife's 62. I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 2.5-year-old, and the same birth mom we've adopted. My little boy, when he's 24, to keep baseline services, so just to keep things, what's that fancy word? Ceteris paribus, keep things even. United States in about 22 years would have to double every single tax. The math basically says my kids will be part of the first generation in America that will be poorer. That's the morality of this place. But David, adopting modernization and cutting spending's really, really hard. And we're going to get someone who's going to say mean things about us. So you're willing to screw over your kids. That's the morality of this place? How is that Republican or Democrat? And then once again, to my friends on the left over here, you know, I've done the whole presentation on it. Go to the Manhattan Institute right now. Look up Riedel's analysis. Every tax hike, and there's a dozen of them, on those $400,000 and up, when you do all the economic effects, produces about 1.5% of GDP. For those of us on the right, here's all the things we're willing to cut. It was about 1% of GDP. If my math is right, that's what, 2.5%. Mr. Speaker, we're going to borrow about 7% of the entire economy this year. Does anyone get the fraud? Well, here's the tax hikes. It's rich people. We're going to do these cuts because we're not willing to do the hard things of modernizing how we deliver services to our brothers and sisters in this country, because we're going to make some bureaucracy, some union, some company out there that lives off delivering the services the way they were doing it 30 years ago, and they don't want to modernize. So once again, over the last 4 years, we've gone from, 4 years ago, the debt was $1,502 billion. Last year, $1,900 billion. Now you got to understand, that number also is a bit of a fraud. What we often don't, the United States is one of the only countries that doesn't actually put in its internal borrowing. So we borrow money from the Social Security Trust Fund, from the Veterans Trust Fund, from all these things. Are we not going to pay it back? You know we pay interest to those. So that's why the real number, like for this year, is going to be closer to $2.3 trillion. Because there's about another $300 billion out there that we borrow internally that we got to also pay back and also have to pay interest. So let's make a point here. Budget deficits are heading to, now I got to make the point, and if there's any staffer who actually writes memos for your boss, this is the one I want you to memorize. If we do the tax hikes that are coming and we don't offset them, we don't pay for them, in 9 years, we're no longer at 7% of the economy in borrowed money. We're at, I think it is 9.2% of the economy is in borrowed money. When the smart people are starting to tell us that small changes in interest rates, are we really dead set on trying to freak out our bankers? The people we turn to and say, please buy U.S. bonds. Help us finance the fact that we can't stop spending. If we went to a 6 handle, let's say this again, a 6 handle on U.S. debt, so 6%, which wasn't, I think before 2008, we were what, 5.5, 6, somewhere in there? In 9 years, 45% of all tax receipts would be just interest. We're playing with live ammunition here, and we seem terrified to own a calculator. So you're going to tell our brothers and sisters, the hardworking people of this country, we're not going to let your taxes be raised. Absolutely. But we don't want to do things that are hard and get yelled at by a lobbyist or some group back home. So we're just going to borrow the money. So we're going to give it to you. And then a few years from now, you're going to find out that productivity in the country has slowed down because the capital stack, another $4 trillion we've sucked out of the economy, doesn't get lent to your business, to you buying a house, to the new to the new piece of equipment. And the economists have already done the calculations, basically saying, I'm sorry, it got crumpled as I was marching over here. You want to maximize the economic growth and the wealth of this country. This is a CBO report. It's been vetted by my economists in Joint Economic. You want to maximize prosperity in the curve. You offset the spending because you're screwing up the available capital, because the reason these people are writing really smart bond houses, are now writing articles, is the binging on debt that's going on in this country, but China and so many other places. Why do you think Great Britain this summer took down their government? Their bonds exploded, they lost their government. What the hell do you think is going on in France? What do you think is going on in Germany? What do you think happened in South Korea? What do you think was happening in Canada? All these countries, even Germany, who are just trying to deal with the financing costs of their pensions, the deliveries. And the United States is much better off than many of these countries, but it's coming fast for us. Do hard things today, maximize prosperity tomorrow for every working person, but also for my kids, maybe for your pension, your retirement. Because, Mr. Speaker, getting older isn't Republican or Democrat, it's math. Go to CBO's data and tell the truth. 100% of the debt for the next 30 years is Social Security and Medicare. The rest of the government actually grows slower than tax receipts. And it's like $124 trillion of borrowing, but everything is basically, we call discretionary, military, discretionary, is actually squeezed to grow slower than the tax receipts. It actually has what they calculate as a positive balance. This isn't mean, because the fact of the matter is we've demonstrated here over and over, you could modernize how we deliver so many of these things to our brothers and sisters who've earned their benefits. You just have to be willing to tell the bureaucracy and the deliverers of those services saying, we expect you to modernize. Because those of us that fixation on watching the bond futures, the debt markets, today's interest rates are almost a full point higher than they were December 1st. If that 1% works its way into U.S. bonds, over the next 10 years, it's almost $3 trillion of additional spending. It's almost everything we're talking about trying to cut. Grow up, figure out how to actually act like we are the board of directors of the biggest economy in the world, understand math, and start being fiscally disciplined. It doesn't mean cruel. It's not cutting and slashing, because if you don't communicate to the world's who we ask for money, they raise our interest rates. And those interest rates are much more cruel than anything we could possibly do. Mr. Speaker, with that I yield back.